Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your mineral rights and royalties. And I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams. Justin, happy Friday.
Happy Friday, Matt. We got an interesting story here talking about density. And it seems like whether you're talking real estate, whether you're talking energy, no matter what you're talking, an increase of density is just the name of the game these days.
That's right. I guess it sort of goes to the concept of entropy, and things are getting more and more chaotic. And I think certainly politically and all of that, that is the case. But we're going to talk, like Justin said, about energy density. We're going to talk about why this is important when it comes to thinking about fossil fuels, the future of fossil fuels, and then what energy sources might replace fossil fuels, and then kind of what are the timelines we might be talking about to get to that point. There's no shortage of news on climate change and the energy transition. I think that is one of those mainstream topics that seems to get rinsed and repeated on the mainstream media. And so you kind of get the party line and the story of, well, the oceans are going to boil. We all need to drive electric cars and have solar panels and wind turbines. And unfortunately, there's a much more nuanced conversation that needs to be happening, and it doesn't seem to be getting a lot of mainstream press. There's others that are having these types of conversations. Chris Wright with Liberty Oilfield Services is one example of one that's having those types of conversations and bringing the truth around, I think, what the pros and cons of energy are. And we've certainly talked about that in the past. We're not going to really dive into that per se around pros and cons of each of these forms of energy, but just what we wanted to do is do a deep dive on energy density, what it is, what are the energy densities of the different forms of energy that we use today, and how does this affect what might happen in the future. So this was a really interesting episode as we were preparing, Justin, and having the conversation before we hit record, that when you look back on history, that really can tell us a lot in terms of how this might progress into the future, I think.
You nailed it, Matt. And to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about here, early human societies, we used biomass energy. We used wood for cooking, heating, and light. And biomass energy is a low-density form of energy. Industrial Revolution came around, and we saw a shift to fossil fuels and coal and natural gas, which was a more dense option for fuel. And then by the 20th century, we saw a rise of nuclear energy. Nuclear is a very dense form, but controversial, as we all know. And then with the 21st century rolling in, we've seen the rise of renewable energies such as solar, wind. And as we were talking before the show, Matt, it's really interesting to see this shift. And history has always shown that we go to more dense forms of energy. And when we talk about solar and wind, we're going to kind of go through the numbers, but it's a less dense form, which is interesting that we're seeing that as the next step.
Now, I think that's really a key point to hone in on. When we had early human societies, we discovered fire. We would burn wood for cooking and heating and light. And then we discovered whale oil as it was a little bit better than wood, but it was maybe not as sustainable, not as scalable as oil and kerosene. And we found those things. And when we drilled wells back in the 1800s, and we said, oh, we have this new form of energy that we can light the streets, we can heat our homes. Coal became a huge thing in terms of transportation. We had the steam engine take shape. It allowed us to go further, faster on ocean-going vessels. And then as we discovered oil, we transitioned to using oil to run those vessels, and that allowed even more range and more opportunity. It was safer. You didn't have boilers exploding and killing people. So it's just these advancements in technology to increasingly dense forms of energy, like Justin mentioned, and of course, nuclear being the pinnacle of that in our current technology. We're going to talk about nuclear fission in terms of the splitting of atoms, which we see with the current nuclear reactors, but there's amazing research going on in nuclear fusion, which is harnessing the power of the atom, which has an incredible amount of energy density, an incredible amount of energy if we can harness that. And so that could be the next step when you think about, again, where we've come from. It's always been taking a step up the staircase to higher and higher density forms of energy. Really in the 21st century, Justin, like you mentioned, it's crazy to think that the next step in that energy transition, we're going to the bottom rung, below biomass and below some of these other forms of energy that we've transitioned from hundreds of years ago. Now we're going the opposite direction, which doesn't seem like it's going to be setting us up for success.
You nailed it, Matt. And as you went through those, something that I think is worth mentioning is there's always been a trade-off for energy. We know that there's a trade-off, and I think solar and wind is no exception. The life cycle of renewables, they have an environmental impact, whether it's land, water, or CO2 emissions, and it's really something to be considered. And as you said, Matt, they're not stacking up very well as far as energy density goes.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. While it's good that we are reducing CO2 emissions in the long run over the life cycle of these technologies, but there's still an impact on the environment from manufacturing and transporting and all the different steps like you mentioned. Now, let's talk some numbers here because I think it really helps to put it in perspective when we talk about the relative energy density between these different forms of energy. So when we talk about the amount of energy that hits the earth every day from the sun, it is an amazing amount of energy. There's no denying that. And I think that has probably been what has caught the imagination of people thinking of, okay, how can we go away from these finite resources like fossil fuels to something that, at least in human history, will be here forever. And so to the extent that we could harness the sun's energy to meet our needs, then it would be an amazing development. This quote that this paper references is that we as a species use less energy in a year than hits the planet in an hour. So, okay, that to me is a compelling story for solar, but how do we actually harness that? How do we get to the point of that being something that's really useful? Because we've spent trillions of dollars just in the past decade or two, and we've only moved the needle by a percentage point or so in terms of the makeup of our energy usage globally. We have wind and solar making up only a few percentage points compared to fossil fuels. Why is that? I mean, it would seem like with the amount of energy hitting the earth that we would just be all powering everything on solar panels, but I think that this energy density really tells the full picture.
I think you nailed it, Matt. And there are other constraints on it as well, as far as being able to store that energy, which could be a game changer for solar and wind. But the numbers just don't stack up. So the report gave us some information, and we broke it down to megajoules per liter to kind of compare the density of these different energy sources. And solar sits firmly at the very bottom of the list at 1,000 megajoules per liter, and wind right above it at 10,000 megajoules per liter. And if we go to the very top of the list here, the most dense, nuclear sits at 1 quadrillion megajoules per liter. And I think it's just a stark contrast, Matt, from where we are and what options we're really exploring currently.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's really the reason, I think, why we haven't gone as far as we were hoping in terms of with wind and solar and the investments of trillions of dollars to try to replace other forms of energy. It's just the fact of the matter is, to your point, Justin, the energy density is just not there. We have 1,000 megajoules per liter versus 1 quadrillion. I mean, that's orders of magnitude. And I think one of the ways to really put this in perspective, there's an infographic on the Nuclear Energy Institute website that compares the power of a uranium pellet in a nuclear reactor and how much energy is in that pellet that's the size of your fingertip. And one uranium fuel pellet the size of your fingertip has as much energy as 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas, 149 gallons of oil, which is roughly 3, almost 4 barrels of oil, and then 1 ton of coal. Not to mention, if you were talking about wind and solar, it would be probably acres and acres of solar panels and wind turbines that would have to be built in order to have the same energy as one uranium fuel pellet. So that just goes to show, and you look at that transition and the advancement of technology and the advancement of human civilization, that we've gone to more and more dense forms of energy because it allows us to scale up all of the technology that has to use energy as the food for those machines, as Alex Epstein likes to say. And that powers our innovations, powers the vehicles that we drive, it powers the electricity that powers our computers and all of the technology that we've developed over the past several hundred years. And if we're looking to advance even further and to raise up the billions of people on the planet that even don't have any electricity today. So Justin, I think one of the things to put this all in perspective is it's easy for us to talk about this academically because we have reliable power that is relatively inexpensive and is easily available for us in the Western world, in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and other places. And you look at other parts of the globe, certainly it's not the case everywhere. And they're looking at just how do they get to that first step? How do they move from burning wood and animal dung to using any form of electricity, let alone whether it's from coal, from gas, from wind or solar? They take anything, just whatever is the most affordable is going to win in those cases. And so I think that's a big consideration as well.
Yep, absolutely, man. It makes it very easy to sit here and talk about it when we don't struggle to get the energy that we need. And something worth connecting here with energy, you're really talking about storage and transportation as well. Whether you're talking about coal, oil, if that density is higher, it's going to cost less space, less time, money to transport and store that energy. And the same goes with solar. It's easier to think of, to kind of distance ourselves from that because it's battery storage, so on and so forth. But the same applies. That density has to be stored for it to be effective. And then we have to be able to effectively generate the power. And Matt, like we talked about earlier, that's been one of the major things that's made a huge impact in economy and industry is that density and the ease to transport and store.
Yeah, and I think that ease of transport and storage becomes increasingly more important when we look at what we're going to fuel transportation. According to this report, there was an interesting quote in there that says, a single gallon of gasoline contains approximately 40 megajoules of chemical energy. Dividing energy by volume leads an energy density of 10 billion joules per cubic meter. Gasoline is 10 quadrillion times more energy dense than solar radiation, 1 billion times more energy dense than wind and water power, and 10 million times more energy dense than human power. So that is a good explanation, I think, of why we use gasoline to power cars and trucks and things like that. So when you think about needing to have something that's got a lot of energy that we can store relatively safely and that takes up a smaller amount of space, that's why we see gasoline and diesel, for that matter, the primary energy sources for ground transportation. Now, we have tried to transition to natural gas powered vehicles and things like that. And that can be compressed and it can be liquefied and so that it can be stored in a relatively small space. But even still, its energy density is lower than that of gasoline. And so it takes up more space. There's also other reasons, logistical and things like that in terms of trying to build out the infrastructure and getting all that built. But when we have the existing system set up for gasoline and diesel power, it's interesting when you see that and think about, okay, how do we transition to battery power as well? It is important because when you think about in a car, only 5% or less of the car's weight is usually fuel. But this is not the case for electric cars, which have heavy batteries. Those batteries take up more than 25% of the car's weight. And so then it becomes a challenge to balance the weight of the car and the battery and the range of the vehicle. And so that's why, as we see advancements in battery technology, these cars are getting manufactured that can go a little bit further and a little bit further. But there's a limit because you can only have so much of that car made up of batteries. They weigh a lot. And even though those electric motors are very powerful, there's a limit to how far those vehicles can go before you have to stop and wait a couple hours to recharge it. So that's the limitation when we talk about especially ground transportation like trucking, and you're taking a long haul truck from California to New York. It's more practical to use diesel as a source of energy, at least right now, until they get the battery technology down light enough to that they can extend that range. But I think that's an important thing. And then Justin, you want to talk a little bit about other forms of transportation, because I think this is also an important thing to think about as far as like flying.
Absolutely, Matt. And the article gives some numbers and statistics relating to this. But if we're talking in terms of jet fuel, so jet fuel is a more refined version of kerosene, and it's used in aviation because it has a high energy density. When you're flying, every pound matters, and it costs a lot of energy to keep the plane flying. For a passenger plane, most of the takeoff weight, around 25 to 45% of that, is the fuel that the plane is carrying. So it makes a significant impact on how much energy it takes to move that plane, so on and so forth. And if we look at rockets, it can be even higher at over 90%. And as you kind of mentioned, Matt, that ratio to weight and density of that energy makes a huge impact in something like a car. Only 5% of a car's weight is usually fuel. However, it's not the case for electric cars. As Matt mentioned, batteries are heavy. They make up about 25% of the car's weight. And it's really challenging to balance that ratio for long trips. Transporting untethered electricity is easy and cheap with power lines, but it becomes a problem when you need to untether something. The energy density of the batteries, as Matt mentioned, is relatively low, and it makes it really unpractical for them to use in electric rockets or planes. Most cases, batteries are too heavy to carry themselves. And Matt, this always leaves room for improvement in battery battery technology, but this is kind of what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, and like you said, I think that's where we see a lot of these technologies like wind and solar taking hold is in power generation, because you can transport it relatively easily with power lines. Obviously, if you're trying to make a solar powered plane, that's just not going to happen because you can't capture enough solar energy by the wings, or the wings would have to be so huge that that's impractical then for that plane to be built. Those are some of the issues. And so when you untether something like Justin mentioned, you need to store that energy in a battery or some other form, whether it's chemical energy or some other potential energy, to be able to harness it later when you're not attached to the grid or attached to the solar panel that you're capturing that energy. I think that's why we've seen very limited application of these forms of energy for transportation, just because you have to have such a large amount of area to capture the amount of energy to transport or to fuel the transportation that you're looking at, whether it's a plane or a car or a truck. So that is never going to really be a solution, I don't think, for powering those types of vehicles, unless, again, you could harness that energy, store it, and then leverage that storage in those batteries. But again, it's, you think about energy density wise, it makes a lot more sense to invest the money into higher energy density forms of energy like nuclear reactors. We have these small modular reactors technology that's being developed now that nuclear energy is being destigmatized to a certain extent. And again, when we look at the amount of money we've invested in these different forms of energy, because of the energy density of uranium fuel and the efficiency of those nuclear reactors, we have only 93 reactors that generate nearly 20% of all U.S. electricity. So if you think about over the past 60, 70 years that we've harnessed this type of technology in nuclear reactors to generate electricity, that we've gone to the point of over 20% of electricity being generated from that, versus solar and wind, we've spent similar amount of money, if not more, to actually only capture maybe 1 or 2 or 3% of the electricity that we generate here in the US. I think that's a compelling story, and it kind of all ties back to energy density.
You nailed it, man. I thought that was a really interesting quote in this article that kind of speaks to what you're saying. And this is referring to the numbers we talked about earlier, comparing the different density of the energies. The quote is, it's difficult to conceptualize the quadrillionth ratio between solar energy and petroleum density. A quadrillionth is a millionth of a billionth. Based upon the current technological, economic, and political climate, the sun, the wind, the moon, the earth, and all of the people cannot compete with what the article quotes here as black gold on the basis of energy density. And man, I think it helps you wrap your brain around the difference that we're talking between solar energy density and petroleum density.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point. And as we consider the trade-offs between all these different forms of energy, there's certainly things that are beneficial about wind and solar, things that are beneficial about geothermal, things that are beneficial about oil, natural gas, and coal. And so I think it's a matter of harnessing those positives and trying to minimize the negatives of each of these forms of energy. And if we're able to do that and continue to transition up that energy density ladder or staircase, then I think that is going to be the best path forward. And whether that is harnessing more nuclear energy, whether that's fission or fusion, and then who knows what else could come in the future that we aren't even thinking about or even aware of today in terms of where we want to go. And I think when you look at from a scientific point of view, there's comparisons of different types of civilizations. I was listening to an interview with Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about different types of civilizations. I think we're a type 0 civilization in that we don't even harness the full power of the sun, up to like I think a type 3 or 4, which utilizes things like Dyson spheres around a star to harness the entire power of that star. When you think about the advancement of civilizations in that context, it's those civilizations use more and more energy. And so if we're going to advance all of humanity, then ultimately we're going to need to be using more and more energy. I think that's a given. And so then the question is, how do we get there, and how long will we be using our current forms of energy? Because I know as a mineral owner, kind of tying this back, we've been talking very esoteric and theoretical about all this stuff, but tying this back to that last quote that you mentioned, that all the world's people cannot compete with black gold on the basis of energy density, Justin, that just tells me that oil and natural gas are going to be here for a long time. And so as a mineral owner, I think that we see a lot of headlines that, oh no, we're going to switch tomorrow to solar and wind. And so the question comes in your back of your mind as well, are my mineral rights going to even be worth anything in a few years? Maybe I should just sell them because we'll stop producing oil. But I think that is, again, not going to be the case just based on physics like we talked about.
Yep, you nailed it, Matt. And the indicator is going to be a much more dense form of energy available to us, and the ability to transport and store that and make it effective for us. And like you said, there's just nothing that competes with oil and natural gas and fossil fuels at the moment. And as we see the rise in nuclear, maybe that'll be the direction that we end up going, but who knows? Time will tell.
Yeah, I mean, that time will tell. But in the meantime, I think until we get like a micro nuclear reactor that you put in the back of your car that you wouldn't worry about nuclear fallout if you got in an accident, I think that we're still going to be using oil and natural gas to power a lot of transportation. And certainly when we look at whether that's flying, driving a car or a truck, transporting goods and services on a truck or rail, it's all using fossil fuels. There's some opportunities to electrify some of that for sure. But I think, again, to your point, Justin, I just see the potential of continued use of fossil fuels for decades, if not centuries. We'll see continued drilling in the United States as long as it's economic to do so. I think the market will determine what the value of these different forms of energy is by the price that people are willing to pay for a barrel of oil or a cubic foot of natural gas. And as long as we're willing to pay prices that are economic for companies to go and continue to explore and to drill additional wells, then that is going to continue. So I think the moral of the story here is don't worry, don't fret if you have mineral rights or royalties and you're worried about that going away. The potential for your property to be developed vanishing when we transition to wind and solar. I think we're talking again over a time period of decades before that is even a possibility. And again, it really depends on our ability to innovate and develop new higher energy density forms of energy to use that might be more environmentally friendly. But again, until then, I think we'll see natural gas certainly and oil play a big part.
I think you said it well, Matt.
All right. Well, that wraps up this episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.